They told her she was useless in a room built to listen to the groaning of a planet. It was an accusation that would echo longer than the seismic event she was about to command, a judgment that would fracture a man's career more completely than any tectonic shear. He saw a quiet woman in a gray jumpsuit. He did not see the architect of his undoing. He saw defiance where there was only data. And when it was over, when the mountain fell silent and the screens glowed with the placid green of survival, her four-word reply was not an attack, but a diagnosis. It was the calm, clinical, and final assessment of a system that had failed. The air in sub-level gamma of Station Indigo was a curated artifact. It was scrubbed of the thin, biting atmosphere of the Akatorian spine 3,000 meters above, yet it retained a coldness all its own, a sterile chill that clung to the brushed steel walls and seeped from the concrete floor. It smelled of ozone from the server racks, the faint, clean scent of ionized air, and the deeper, subterranean perfume of damp rock and earth that no filtration system could ever truly erase. It was the smell of being buried alive by choice. Specialist Eva Rostova found a strange comfort in it. The silence was the primary feature of the environment, a heavy pressurized thing that was not the absence of sound, but the active presence of immense geological weight. It was the sound of 100 million tons of granite and gneiss pressing down, a constant, subliminal reminder of their precarious position within the planet's crust. Eva sat before a triptych of obsidian glass monitors, her posture a study in stillness. Her world was rendered in waves and spectrographs, in cascading lines of code that translated the deep, slow breathing of the Earth into legible data. The primary display showed a real-time seismic feed from the 150 geophones she had personally calibrated, their sensors seeded throughout the mountain range like a vast, listening web. The lines were mostly flat, a gentle, rhythmic oscillation that was the planet's resting heartbeat. To the untrained eye, it was a display of profound boredom. To Eva, it was a delicate equilibrium, a complex symphony of gravitational stress, magma displacement, and tectonic friction held in a fragile, beautiful truce. She saw the subtle flutter in the feed from sensor G72, a micro-tremor consistent with ice fracturing on the high glaciers, and mentally cross-referenced it with the cryoacoustic data streaming on her left-hand monitor. The correlation was perfect, a non-event. Her fingers moved with fluid economy across the holographic interface projected just above her console, isolating the waveform, tagging it, and archiving it with a few precise gestures. The system logs registered the action under her user ID, S.R.O.S.T.O.V.A.C.I.V.A.N.A.L.Y.S.T. Her focus was absolute, a state of deep immersion that rendered the world outside her data stream's peripheral muted. She tracked the slow, inexorable drift of the Eurasian plate against the smaller Anatolian subplate, a geological drama unfolding on a timescale that dwarfed human history. Her work was to listen for the whispers that preceded the roar, to find the anomalous signal hidden within the planetary noise. Station Indigo was officially a joint military geological research facility, a cover that was technically true. Its real purpose, known only to a select few, was to monitor for unconventional subsurface threats. Tectonic weapons, deep earth drilling for clandestine tunnels, resonance-based sabotage, the esoteric and terrifying bleeding edge of 21st century warfare. Eva was the station's nerve ending, its sole interpreter of the Earth's arcane language. Her jumpsuit was a slate gray, devoid of rank or insignia, marking her as a civilian attachment. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and her face, pale in the glow of the monitors, was a mask of neutral concentration. She was an anomaly in this military bastion, a scholar among soldiers, and she cultivated an aura of invisibility. She moved through the station's corridors with a quiet efficiency that rarely drew a second glance, her presence as subtle as the low-frequency hum of the life support systems. The station's technical crew, the engineers and signal specialists, had long ago learned to appreciate her. They saw the results of her work, the preemptive warnings about unstable rock strata that prevented tunnel collapses, the precise resonance mapping that allowed them to install new comms conduits without triggering microfractures. They respected her competence, a currency more valuable than rank in the belly of the earth. The disruption arrived with the hiss of the mag-sealed door to the command center. It was a sound that shattered the carefully maintained quiet. Commander Valerius did not enter a room. He conquered it. He was a large man, made larger by the rigid carriage of a career officer and the crisp, decorated uniform of the Alliance Marine Corps. His voice was a blunt instrument, accustomed to filling hangars and parade grounds, and it ricocheted off the sound-dampening panels of the command center with abrasive force. "Report!" he boomed, his gaze sweeping the room with an air of proprietary disdain. He was here for a 2-week command inspection, a tour of the Alliance's most remote and strategically vital outposts. From his perspective, Station Indigo was a high-tech hole in the ground, staffed by technicians and, to his evident disgust, a civilian. Sergeant Jian Li, the station's chief engineer and de facto second-in-command, rose to meet him. Lai was a compact man whose calm demeanor belied a mind that thought in schematics and power flow diagrams. "Commander, all systems are green. The station is operating at 99.8% efficiency," Li stated, his voice even. "The 2/10 discrepancy is a known issue with the secondary atmospheric scrubber in Sector Beta. We have a scheduled maintenance cycle." Valerius grunted, a sound of profound dissatisfaction. He seemed offended by the lack of crisis. His eyes scanned the room, passing over the uniformed technicians at their consoles before landing, and lingering on Ava. She had not turned. She had not acknowledged his presence in any way. Her attention remained fixed on the slow, steady dance of the seismic data. This, to a man like Valerius, was not professional focus. It was insubordination. "And that?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt as he gestured a thumb toward Ava's workstation. "What is the purpose of the civilian?" Li's expression remained neutral, a practiced mask he had perfected over years of dealing with officers like Valerius. "That is Specialist Rostova, sir. She's our lead geophysicist. She monitors the tectonic stability of the region." "Monitors," Valerius repeated, savoring the word as if it were an obscenity. He strode across the command deck, his boots striking the floor with an authority the room's quiet professionalism rejected. He stopped directly behind Eva, looming over her, a mountain of ego casting a shadow over her console. "So you sit here and watch squiggly lines all day, Specialist?" Eva did not flinch. She completed the annotation of a minor barometric pressure fluctuation that had faintly registered on a surface sensor. Her movements unhurried. Only when the task was complete did she slowly turn her head, her gray eyes meeting his. They were calm, analytical, and held no trace of fear or deference. "These squiggly lines, Commander," she replied, her voice soft but clear, carrying easily in the acoustically precise room, are a direct representation of the immense and volatile energies contained within the rock around us. I don't just watch them, I interpret them. Her lack of a "sir" was a deliberate omission, a subtle refusal to play his game of hierarchical dominance. Valerius's face tightened, a muscle jumping in his jaw. He was a man who understood power only in its most overt forms: shouted orders, crisp salutes, the rigid adherence to protocol. Ava's quiet, factual confidence was a language he did not speak and therefore could not tolerate. He saw it as a challenge to his authority, a personal affront delivered in the presence of his subordinates. Interpret them, he scoffed, turning to address the room, as if she were a specimen he was dissecting for their benefit. For what purpose? To tell us if the mountain is having a bad day? This is a military installation, not a university geology department. We are here to project force, to maintain a strategic deterrent. Your work, specialist, seems utterly superfluous to that mission. A waste of taxpayer money and a valuable seat in a classified facility. The accusation hung in the air, thick and unpleasant. The other technicians kept their eyes glued to their own screens, a collective, silent refusal to be drawn into their commander's orbit of aggression. They knew the value of Ava's work. They had seen her predict a cascade failure in a geothermal vent that would have flash-cooked half of Sector Delta. They had watched her build the resonance profile that allowed them to communicate through 3 kilometers of solid granite using ultra-low-frequency signals. To them, she was not superfluous. She was essential. Sergeant Lee took a half-step forward, a subtle movement of solidarity. Commander, Specialist Rostova's analysis is vital to the station's operational integrity. Her data ensures the long-term safety and viability of this entire facility. Valerius waved a dismissive hand, cutting Lee off. His focus was entirely on Ava, a predator singling out its prey. He leaned down, placing his hands on her console, invading her personal space. The smell of his sharp, artificial cologne was an unwelcome intrusion in the sterile air. Let me be clear, Specialist. I have commanded battle groups in the Orion Nebula and led planetary assaults in the Serpentis system. I know what is vital and what is not. Men with guns are vital. Ships with cannons are vital. Data analysts who stare at rocks are a luxury we cannot afford. You are a civilian. You are a guest in my world, and from where I stand, you are useless. The word useless landed with the flat finality of a judge's gavel. It was the culmination of his frustration, the bluntest expression of his worldview. He expected a reaction, tears perhaps, anger, a flustered, defensive justification of her existence. He was prepared for any of those, ready to dissect them with practiced cruelty. He was not prepared for what he got. Ava simply held his gaze. Her expression did not change. The analytical calm in her eyes did not waver. She gave his pronouncement the same consideration she would give to an anomalous data point, assessing it for content and discarding it as irrelevant noise. After a moment of pure, unbroken silence, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Your assessment is noted, Commander," she said, her voice a monotone. Then she turned back to her screens, her fingers once again flying across the holographic interface, dismissing him as completely as she had dismissed the barometric pressure fluctuation moments before. The dismissal was so absolute, so devoid of emotion, that for a moment Valerius was stunned into silence. He had been nullified. His display of power had been met not with resistance, but with utter indifference. His declaration of her worthlessness had been logged and filed like any other piece of trivial data. He was a storm that had broken against a cliff face, his fury dissipating into nothing. The faint flush of anger on his cheeks deepened to a dark, mottled crimson. The silence in the command center was now his enemy. It amplified his humiliation, turning the quiet focus of the technicians into a collective judgment against him. "We will be having a formal review of your position here, Specialist," he snarled, his voice low and threatening. He straightened up, pulling the tatters of his authority around him like a shroud. "This facility will be brought back in line with military protocol. There will be discipline. There will be order." He spun on his heel and strode from the room, the mag-sealed door hissing shut behind him, leaving a wake of simmering resentment and a silence that felt heavier than before. Jianli let out a slow, controlled breath. He walked over to Eva's station. She didn't look up. "Are you all right, Specialist?" he asked quietly. "The commander's emotional state has no bearing on the lithospheric pressure in this quadrant," she replied, her focus already back on a new set of incoming data. "He is an irrelevant variable." Lee looked at the back of her head, at the unwavering focus she possessed. He had a feeling that Commander Valerius had just made a very serious mistake. He had tried to measure a force of nature with a parade ground swagger, and he had come up wanting. The confrontation was over for now. But the challenge had been laid down, and the mountain, in its own time, would provide the arena for the final verdict. The first tremor came without warning. It was not the violent, shuddering lurch of a classic earthquake. It was a subtle, high-frequency vibration, a deep hum that seemed to resonate directly in the bones. It was a sound you felt more than heard, a planetary-scale tuning fork struck miles below. The lights in the command center flickered once, a brief, anxious stutter. A few technicians looked up from their consoles, exchanging uneasy glances. Valerius, who had been brooding in the small, glass-walled office overlooking the command deck, emerged immediately. "What was that? Report," he demanded, his voice tight with the need to reassert control. "Minor seismic event, Commander," one of the junior technicians called out, reading from his station's general environmental feed. "Epicenter is indeterminate. Probably just a deep rock settlement. Happens all the time." Valerius nodded, seizing on the mundane explanation. "As you were, maintain vigilance." He stood with his arms crossed, a sentinel eager for a threat he could understand, a threat he could shoot. But Ava knew. She had felt it not in her bones, but in her data. The moment the vibration had started, her screens had exploded. The placid lines of the seismographs were gone, replaced by a jagged, chaotic scribble. But it was not chaos. To her, it was a language. She saw the frequency, a tight, unnatural 22.4 hertz. Tectonic plates did not shear at 22.4 hertz. Rock did not settle at that frequency. It was a manufactured resonance, a signal as artificial as a radio broadcast. Her fingers flew across her console, her mind a whirlwind of calculation. She cross-referenced the signal's amplitude with its propagation speed through the known geological strata. The energy was not dissipating. It was being focused. A second hum, deeper and more powerful than the first, rolled through the station. This time, a fine shower of dust drifted down from the ceiling conduits. A red light began to flash on the main structural integrity board. "Sir, we have a stress warning on the primary support arch in Sector Gamma 7, Lee reported, his voice sharp with concern. "The strain gauges are showing a 20% spike." "Impossible," Valerius snapped. "This facility is rated to withstand a 9.5 quake. A little shudder shouldn't be dusting the ceiling." He was applying the textbook. Station Indigo was a fortress, built to endure the worst Mother Nature could throw at it. But this wasn't Mother Nature. "It is not a quake," Eva said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. All eyes turned to her. She swiped a hand across her interface, projecting her central display onto the main holographic map in the center of the room. The serene topographic image of the Akatorian spine was now overlaid with a terrifying, pulsing red web. "This is an attack!" The web of red lines converged on a single point, Station Indigo. "What is this, specialist?" Valerius demanded, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "More of your interpretive nonsense?" "That is a resonance cascade," Eva explained, her tone devoid of alarm, as if she were delivering a lecture. "The enemy is using a series of phased seismic emitters. They are not trying to shake us apart with a single, brute force impact. They are using focused, sympathetic frequencies. They are tuning the mountain. That first tremor was 22.4 hertz. The second was 31.6. They are finding the resonant frequency of the granite batholith this station is built into. Once they find it, they will amplify it until the molecular bonds in the rock itself begin to fail. They are not trying to knock down the fortress. Commander, they are trying to liquefy the foundation it stands on." The clinical horror of her explanation descended on the room. The technicians stared at the pulsing red map. The abstract threat of unconventional warfare suddenly made terrifyingly real. They were inside the target, a target that was being vibrated into dust from the inside out. A third wave hit, stronger still. This one was a physical blow. The floor bucked violently, throwing one of the technicians from his chair. A bank of secondary monitors went dark, and the piercing shriek of a coolant leak alarm joined the chorus of warnings. "Structural integrity alarms in all sectors," Lee shouted, struggling to stay upright. "We're getting microfractures across the entire superstructure." Valerius's face was pale, his arrogance curdling into confusion and fear. His entire career had been spent fighting enemies he could see, enemies that bled. How was he supposed to fight a frequency? How did he give orders to charge a vibration? He fell back on the only thing he knew. "Seal the blast doors, security teams to full alert, prepare for imminent ground assault," he bellowed. "Get me a line to high command. I want orbital support now." "Sir, the comms array is offline," a signals officer yelled back. "The vibrations are playing hell with the tight beam emitters. All we have is static." "Useless," Valerius roared, slamming his fist on a console. His orders were nonsensical. Sealing the blast doors was irrelevant when the very rock around them was the weapon. A ground assault was a fantasy. His training, his experience, his entire paradigm of warfare was obsolete in the face of this enemy. His attempts to exert control only sowed more chaos. The men in the room looked at him, their faces etched with a new and terrifying doubt. Their leader had no answers. He was shouting into the void, a king with no kingdom. A fourth wave, the most violent yet, slammed into the station. It was a deep, grinding concussion that felt like the planet was trying to shrug them off its back. A heavy support beam tore loose from the ceiling with a scream of tortured metal and crashed to the floor, showering the area in sparks and concrete debris. The main lights died, plunging the command center into the terrifying red gloom of the emergency lighting. The groaning of the station's superstructure was constant now, the sound of a dying beast. Panic began to set in, a palpable, choking thing. Men who had faced down enemy fire were now staring at the solid rock walls with primal fear. Their fortress had become their tomb. In the midst of the rising panic, in the heart of the red-lit chaos, one person remained still. Eva Rostova sat at her console, which was running on its own dedicated power source. The red emergency light cast stark shadows across her face, but her eyes were clear, her focus absolute. She had been tracking the progression of the frequencies, plotting their curve. 22.4, 31.6, 44.7. It was a Fibonacci sequence, predictable, elegant in its own horrifying way. They were closing in on the primary resonant frequency. She calculated they had maybe 2 more pulses, 3 minutes at most, before the cascade became irreversible and Station Indigo, along with a cubic mile of mountain, collapsed into a gravel pit. Valerius, his authority shattered, his face slick with sweat, finally seemed to see her. He saw her stillness, her unnatural calm. It was the last thing in the room that was not shaking, not breaking. "You," he gasped, stumbling towards her. "You said you could interpret this. What now? What do your squiggly lines say now?" It was a desperate plea disguised as a challenge. Eva finished a final calculation. She turned to face him, her expression unchanged. "They say the enemy is methodical, and they say we have approximately 170 seconds before catastrophic structural failure." The clinical finality of her statement extinguished the last embers of panic and replaced them with a cold, stark dread. This was it. This was the end. The room was paralyzed, caught between the failure of the old authority and the terror of the unknown. It was in that moment of collective paralysis that Eva Rostova stood up. She did not seize command. She did not shout. She simply became the new center of gravity in the room. Her quiet competence was now the only resource that mattered. "Sergeant Lee," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the groaning of the dying station. "I need you to reroute all non-essential power to the main geothermal resonance emitter. Bypass the safety protocols and the surge protectors. I need 120% of the station's total energy output available on my mark." Lee stared at her. What she was asking was insane. Overloading the emitter like that could slag the entire power grid, or worse, vaporize the emitter core itself, taking the station with it. It was a desperate all-or-nothing gamble. He looked from Eva's calm, certain face to Commander Valerius, who stood gaping. His authority evaporated, a useless relic of a world that no longer existed. "That is a direct contradiction of operational safety protocols," Valerius sputtered, a ghost trying to issue orders. "I am still in command here, and I forbid it. Sergeant, you will follow my—" "With all due respect, Commander," Jianli said, his voice hard as tungsten steel. "Your way is getting us killed." He turned his back on Valerius, a gesture of finality more profound than any insult. He faced Eva. "I'm with her. What are your instructions, Specialist?" That was the turn. The moment the hierarchy of rank was supplanted by the hierarchy of competence. One by one, the other technicians turned to face Eva, their expressions a mixture of fear and a desperate, burgeoning hope. They had their new commander. Authority had not been taken. It had flowed, naturally and irrevocably, to the only person in the room who had a solution. "The enemy is using a constructive interference pattern to amplify their signal within the rock," Eva began, her voice the calm epicenter of the storm. The station groaned again, a violent shudder that sent a fresh rain of dust from the ceiling. She didn't flinch. "We are going to fight resonance with resonance. We will create a destructive interference pattern, a counterwave. We are going to use their own physics against them, and turn this mountain into a standing wave nullification field. She pointed to a schematic on her screen. The main emitter was designed for deep Earth tomography, to send out precisely controlled seismic pulses. We are going to repurpose it into a weapon. Lee, I need that power, now. On it, Lee said, already moving towards a power distribution terminal, his hands flying across the controls. Bypassing safeties, rerouting primary and secondary conduits. The emitter is drawing a massive load, specialist. The core temperature is climbing fast. It will hold, Eva stated. It was not a hope. It was a fact based on her knowledge of the emitter's materials and thermal tolerances. She turned to the two remaining signals technicians. I need you to slave the emitter's frequency modulator to my console. I will be controlling the output waveform in real time. Latency needs to be under 3 milliseconds. Can you do it? Yes, ma'am, one of them said. The ma'am, instinctive and absolute. They began furiously rerouting data pathways, their fear channeled into focused, desperate work. Another wave hit, the penultimate one. The floor heaved, and the emergency lights flickered wildly. A section of the far wall cracked, a jagged black line spreading like a spider web across the reinforced concrete. The sound was deafening, the grinding of a world coming apart. They're locking in, Eva said, her eyes fixed on the frequency graph. Final resonance is 58.2 hertz. They're starting the amplification sequence. We have one chance. Lee, status. Power is at 120%, Lee yelled over the din. The core is critical. She can't take this for more than a minute. Signals are slaved to your board, specialist, the technician confirmed. You have control. Ava's hands moved over her holographic console. It was no longer a tool for analysis. It was an instrument, and she was its virtuoso. A new waveform appeared on her screen, a perfect inverse of the enemy's signal. It was beautiful in its deadly symmetry. I'm generating the counter frequency, she said, her voice a low, intense murmur. Matching phase, inverting amplitude, standing by for release. She watched the enemy's signal on her monitor. It was building, a crescendo of pure destructive energy pouring into the mountain. The vibrations were so intense now that the console itself was shaking, blurring the lines on the screen. Eva seemed to be the only thing in the universe that was still. She closed her eyes for a single second, not in prayer, but in calculation, feeling the rhythm of the attack, syncing her own internal clock to its destructive pulse. She was listening to the mountain, and it was screaming. The next wave will be the final one, she stated. She opened her eyes. They were luminous with concentration. She placed one finger over a single, glowing rune on her holographic interface. The activate command. Wait for the peak of their amplitude, she murmured to herself. Don't anticipate. Match it. Perfectly. The final wave began. It was not a vibration anymore. It was a solid, physical force, as if the entire station were in the grip of a colossal hand, being crushed. The lights went out completely, leaving only the glow of the monitors. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar of grinding rock and shrieking metal. Valerius was on the floor, huddled against a wall, his face a mask of abject terror. This was the end. The mountain was collapsing. Eva watched the spike on her graph climb. Higher, higher. The red line of the enemy's attack neared its absolute peak, the point of no return. Her face was illuminated by its apocalyptic glow. Now! Her finger descended. For a fraction of a second, the crushing force intensified, as if two gods were wrestling in the heart of the stone. The station screamed, a final agonized cry of metal and concrete pushed beyond every conceivable limit. And then silence. It was not the heavy, pressurized silence of before. This was a different kind of quiet. It was a pure, profound, and absolute emptiness. The vibration ceased. The grinding stopped. The alarms fell silent. The shriek of the coolant leak was gone. Even the low hum of the station's machinery seemed to have vanished. It was the silence of a vacuum, a silence so total it rang in the ears. The red emergency lights flickered back on, steady now, casting a hellish, motionless glow over the wreckage of the command center. Dust hung thick in the air, a silent, swirling nebula. No one moved. No one breathed. The crew, frozen in their positions, looked around in stunned disbelief. They were alive. The tomb had not closed. The technicians stared at the walls, at the ceiling, as if expecting them to resume their violent shaking. But there was nothing. Only the profound, unearthly quiet. Slowly, every eye in the room turned to Ava. She stood before her console, her hand still hovering over the interface. The screen before her showed two waveforms, one red and one blue, perfectly overlaid, canceling each other out into a single, flat, green line. The line of equilibrium, the line of survival. She had done it. She had met a force that could level a mountain and had nullified it with pure mathematics. It was not a victory of firepower, but of intellect. It was a checkmate delivered in the language of physics. Jian Li was the first to break the spell. He let out a shaky breath that plumed in the cold, dusty air. He looked at the power board. "Emitter core is stable," he said, his voice hoarse with awe. "Power grid is holding. All systems are returning to normal parameters." He looked at Ava, his face a mixture of gratitude and sheer, unadulterated wonder. He had witnessed a miracle of applied science, a feat of arms more impressive than any battle he had ever studied. In that moment of profound stillness, a new sound intruded. It was a soft, electronic chime, a sound no one had heard in what felt like an eternity. It was the sound of an incoming communication. One of the signals officers, his face pale with shock, stared at his console. "Sir, specialist," he stammered, unsure who to address. "I have a signal, a secure channel, priority 0. It's not a standard Alliance military frequency. I don't recognize the encryption." "Put it through," Eva said, her voice calm. She had already lowered her hand and was running a diagnostic on the station's sensor network. For her, the crisis was over. The time for data collection had begun. A voice, crisp, calm, and imbued with an unshakable authority, filled the silent room. It was not broadcast over the general address system, but came directly from the main comm station speaker, an intimate and focused sound. "This is General Madsen for Echo. Come in, Echo." The technicians exchanged confused glances. Echo. There was no one with that call sign at Station Indigo. Valerius, slowly picking himself up from the floor, his uniform covered in dust, his face a ruin of his former arrogance, looked just as bewildered. Ava walked over to the comm station. She keyed the transmitter. "Madsen, this is Echo," she replied, her voice as level as ever. "I read you. Send your traffic." There was a pause on the other end. The general's voice returned with a hint of warmth that was almost startling. "Glad to hear your voice, Echo. We were monitoring the regional seismic distortion from orbital assets. It looked energetic. What is your situation?" Eva glanced at the wreckage of the command center, at the cracked walls and the fallen support beam. The facility has sustained moderate structural damage. There are no casualties. The external threat has been neutralized. We are secure. Understood, the general said. We tracked the source of the resonance cascade to a mobile emitter platform in the eastern foothills. A kill team has already been dispatched. I need your formal assessment of the station's command performance. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, settled over Commander Valerius. He saw his career, his reputation, his entire world crumbling before his eyes. He stumbled forward, desperate to seize this last, vanishing chance to save himself. "General," he shouted, pushing his way toward the comms console. "This is Commander Valerius, Station Commander. I demand to know who you are." The general's voice turned to ice. "I am the man you report to, Commander. Or rather, the man you used to report to. Your authority at Station Indigo was provisional, pending Specialist Rostova's final assessment. I am now asking for that assessment." Valerius stared, his mind refusing to process the words. Provisional, pending her assessment? He looked at Ava, at the quiet, unassuming civilian he had dismissed and humiliated. The full, horrifying scope of his miscalculation began to dawn on him. He had not been testing a subordinate. He had been the one under examination. Desperation made him reckless. "General, this woman is an insubordinate civilian who disobeyed my direct orders," he yelled, his voice cracking. "She endangered this entire facility with a reckless, unauthorized procedure. She should be arrested. She's useless. I demand she be removed and court-martialed." The line went silent for a long, heavy moment. The entire room held its breath. The general's voice, when it returned, was flat and devoid of all emotion. "Echo, your assessment of the commander." Eva looked at Valerius. She did not see a man. She saw a failed component, a malfunctioning system. Her gray eyes were like lenses, recording his panicked breathing, his sweat-sheened face, the tremor in his hands. Her gaze was not filled with malice or triumph. It was the detached, clinical gaze of a diagnostician. She keyed the microphone. She delivered her report. "He lacks the context." 4 words. They were not an insult. They were not an accusation. They were a final, devastating, and complete diagnosis of his failure. They spoke to his inability to understand the nature of the threat, his failure to adapt, his catastrophic reliance on an obsolete doctrine. They encapsulated his entire being in a prison of his own limitations. He did not understand the battlefield, the weapon, the mission, or the woman standing before him. He lacked the context for survival. The judgment was passed. The general's voice came back instantly, cold and final. "Assessment received and confirmed, Echo. Commander Valerius, you are hereby relieved of command. You will surrender your sidearm to Sergeant Lee and confine yourself to your quarters under guard. An escort will arrive at 600 to transport you for your debriefing and formal discharge inquiry. That is all." Valerius stood as if he had been turned to stone. The words washed over him, stripping him of his rank, his pride, his future. He looked at the faces of the technicians, seeing not pity, but the cold, hard glint of justified contempt. He looked at Sergeant Lee, who was already calmly walking toward him, his hand extended not in salute, but to receive his weapon. And finally, he looked at Eva. She had already turned away, her attention back on a data screen. He had been assessed, found wanting, and discarded. He was no longer a relevant variable. As Lee quietly and professionally disarmed the now former commander and led him from the room, General Madsen's voice returned. "Director Rostova," he said. the change in title landing with the force of a physical blow in the quiet room. Apologies for the theatricality of the situation, but we needed to see how the traditional command structure would react under asymmetric pressure. Valerius was the final data point in that experiment. Director Rostova, not specialist. The crew of Station Indigo stared at her, their minds reeling. The quiet civilian analyst they had worked alongside for 6 months was the director of the Asymmetric Warfare Directorate's Terrestrial Threats Division. The woman Valerius had called useless held a position so high, so clandestine, that most of them had never even heard of it. Her presence here had not been an assignment, it had been an audit. She was not just an interpreter of the Earth's whispers. She was one of the secret masters of its wars. The entire narrative of their existence on Station Indigo had just been rewritten. "The experiment is concluded, General," Eva, Director Rostova, replied into the comms. "The data is unequivocal. Our field command protocols are dangerously outdated." "I concur," Madsen said. "A full report is already on its way to the Joint Chiefs. Your extraction is scheduled for 0700. Well done, Eva." The line went dead. A new order had descended upon Station Indigo. It was an order based not on shiny insignia or loud voices, but on quiet, demonstrated, irrefutable competence. The remaining crew moved with a renewed, focused purpose, beginning the work of clearing the debris and running full diagnostics. They gave their new, undeclared leader a wide berth. They treated her not with the familiarity they had shown the specialist, but with the profound, almost fearful reverence reserved for a living legend. She showed no pleasure in her victory, no satisfaction in Valerius's downfall. The outcome had been a logical probability from the moment he had entered the room. Her work was simply to observe the equation and wait for its inevitable solution. She returned to her console, her focus already shifting to the next problem, analyzing the enemy's emitter signature to make their technology her own. Hours later, as the first hint of dawn began to touch the snow-covered peaks 3,000 meters above, Sergeant Jian Li approached her station. The command center was cleaner now, the worst of the wreckage cleared away. He did not speak. He simply placed a steaming mug of black coffee on the edge of her console, just beyond the perimeter of her holographic interface. It was a simple, profound gesture. He was not offering tribute to a director or thanks to a savior. He was offering a sign of professional respect to a fellow practitioner of a difficult craft. Ava looked up from her screen, her eyes briefly meeting his. The enemy emitter used a yttrium-gallium garnet matrix for its resonance chamber, she said, her voice quiet. It's an interesting choice. High energy efficiency, but prone to harmonic fragmentation if you push it past 60 Hz. A potential design flaw we can exploit. Lee nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He had not asked a question, but she had given him an answer. She was teaching him. She was acknowledging his competence, his right to understand. "Thank you, Director," he said softly. "Ava," she corrected him, a flicker of something almost human in her gaze, before her attention returned to the glowing lines of data. When the silent, black-painted tilt rotor arrived to collect her at 700, she left as she had arrived, with a single small duffel bag and an aura of profound quiet. She paused at the door of the command center and looked back, not at the crew, but at the main holographic map, which once again showed the serene, stable topography of the Akatorian spine. The mountain was quiet. The truce she had brokered with the laws of physics was holding. Her work here was done. She stepped through the door and was gone, leaving behind a humbled crew, a broken commander, and a legend that would be whispered in the deep, quiet places of the earth for years to come. In the end, it was never about the woman they dismissed. It was about the fundamental laws of the universe she represented. Authority based on ego is a fragile, hollow thing, a brittle crust over a core of insecurity. Competence, true and deep, is a force of nature. It does not need to be loud. It does not need permission. When the ground begins to shake and the old structures fail, it is the only thing that remains. She was the quiet professional, the ghost in the machine, and her legacy was not the career she ended, but the simple, unshakable truth she had so effortlessly demonstrated. In the face of a crisis, context is everything.